A routine flight turns tense. Flight 567 was scheduled for an uneventful journey from Los Angeles to New York, carrying a mix of business professionals, families, and vacationers. The crew, led by experienced flight attendant Clara Jensen, had started the day like any other, ensuring passengers were seated, carry-ons were stored, and safety protocols were delivered with practiced efficiency. Clara was known for her professionalism and poise, even in challenging situations. As the plane took off, passengers settled into their routines. Some were engrossed in books or movies, while others chatted quietly. Among them was Martin Hayes, a middle-aged businessman on his way to an important meeting. Martin was polite but visibly anxious. He was assigned a middle seat, squeezed between two strangers. For a man accustomed to space and comfort, the arrangement was less than ideal. Martin decided to ask for a change. Noticing an empty aisle seat nearby, he pressed the call button. Clara, who had been distributing drinks, responded promptly. Her smile was professional but slightly strained, a reflection of the long day she was enduring. "Hello, sir. How can I help you?" Clara asked, her tone measured. Martin gestured toward the empty seat. "I noticed that spot over there is free. Would it be possible for me to switch?" Clara glanced at the seat and frowned slightly. "I'll need to check with my colleague. Sometimes seats are left empty for weight distribution or other reasons. Please hold on." Martin nodded, but as Clara walked away, a sense of irritation began to creep in. It seemed like a simple request. Why the hesitation? He glanced around, noticing other passengers shifting in their seats, watching the interaction. Clara returned a minute later, her expression more guarded. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes, but that seat is reserved. It's unavailable for switching." Martin frowned. "Reserved? By whom?" "No one's sitting there." "I understand, sir, but I can't authorize a move to that seat." Martin's voice rose slightly. "This is ridiculous. I'm not asking for first class. It's one empty seat." Clara's smile tightened. "Sir, I need you to remain calm. This is the policy, and I have to enforce it." The exchange caught the attention of passengers nearby. Some glanced up from their books, their curiosity piqued. Others leaned closer, eager to catch every word. Tension rippled through the cabin, unsettling the atmosphere. "Calm," Martin said, his frustration spilling over. "I've been polite. I've made a reasonable request. Why is this so difficult?" Clara's tone shifted, her composure cracking slightly. "Sir, please understand." "I understand perfectly," Martin interrupted, his voice louder now. "You're making this difficult for no reason." The exchange escalated. Clara felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her, her training urging her to remain calm. But exhaustion and frustration gnawed at her resolve. Her response was sharper than she intended. "Sir, you're being unreasonable. Please return to your seat and respect the rules." The comment landed heavily, stirring murmurs among the passengers. Martin's face reddened, his dignity bruised. "Unreasonable. I've paid for this ticket like everyone else. Who do you think you are to speak to me like that?" The cabin fell silent. Clara's hand trembled slightly as she gestured for Martin to lower his voice. "Sir, this is not the way to address a crew member." The tension reached a boiling point. Martin stood, his towering frame imposing as he gestured toward the empty seat. "This is ridiculous. All I ask it." In a moment that would be dissected and debated endlessly, Clara acted on impulse. The stress, the judgmental stares, the mounting pressure. It all boiled over. Her hand rose, and a sharp slap landed on Martin's cheek. The cabin gasped collectively. The sound of the slap echoed like a gunshot. Martin froze, his hand touching his cheek in stunned disbelief. Clara stepped back, her face pale, realizing what she had done. Passengers whispered furiously. Did she just slap him? One elderly woman murmured, her voice quivering. It can't be real. Another passenger replied, wide-eyed. Martin stared at Clara, his expression a mixture of shock and outrage. "Did you just slap me?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. Clara stammered, her mind racing. Her hand shook as if it belonged to someone else. "I didn't mean." "I'm sorry, sir." Her apology hung in the air, feeble and insufficient. Martin straightened, his voice cold and measured. "I want to speak to your supervisor now." Clara opened her mouth to respond, but her words caught in her throat. She looked around, her gaze darting from the stunned passengers to her colleagues, who were already moving to intervene. One of them, a younger flight attendant named Rachel, stepped forward, placing a calming hand on Martin's arm. "Sir, please, let's take this to the back of the plane," Rachel said, her tone soothing. "We'll sort this out." Martin hesitated, then nodded curtly. He followed Rachel to the rear of the cabin, his posture stiff. Clara stood frozen, her thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. She felt the weight of every stare, every whispered conversation. Her career, her reputation, it all hung by a thread. Passengers exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from disbelief to anger. The slap had shattered the thin veneer of civility aboard Flight 567, leaving behind a cabin brimming with tension and unresolved questions. As Clara remained rooted to the spot, she knew one thing for certain. This moment would define her life in ways she could never have imagined. And the fallout was only beginning. The fallout begins. The atmosphere on Flight 567 was now thick with unease. Whispers rippled through the cabin like a rogue wave, as passengers craned their necks to catch glimpses of Clara, who remained near the galley, her face pale and her hands trembling. Meanwhile, Martin sat in the last row, his jaw tight, still nursing the red mark on his cheek. His silence was more unsettling than any outburst. Rachel, the younger flight attendant who had intervened, returned to the front of the plane after trying to calm Martin. She approached Clara cautiously, her voice low and urgent. "What were you thinking?" she whispered, her wide eyes betraying a mix of shock and fear. "This is going to escalate fast." Clara's lips parted, but no words came. Her mind was a whirlwind of regret, shame, and dread. How had it come to this? She'd handled countless difficult passengers over her career, from entitled businessmen to frightened children throwing tantrums. Never had she crossed the line like this. Passengers continued to murmur, their tones accusatory and incredulous. "I've never seen anything like it," one man whispered to his seatmate, a flight attendant, of all people. "She completely lost it," the other replied, shaking his head. "Unprofessional doesn't even cover it." In the back of the plane, Martin sat stiffly, his phone clutched in his hand. He had already begun drafting an official complaint in his email, each word meticulously chosen to convey the gravity of what had happened. This wasn't just about the slap. It was about dignity, about being treated with respect. He glanced up as Rachel returned, this time with a cup of water. "Mr. Hayes," she said gently, her tone placating, "I want to sincerely apologize for what happened. This is not how we operate. I assure you, the matter is being taken seriously." Martin met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "An apology doesn't undo what happened," he said evenly. "She humiliated me in front of everyone. I expect to speak with someone in authority the moment we land." "You will," Rachel promised, her voice steady despite the tension in her own chest. She placed the cup of water on the tray table in front of him. "Please, just try to relax for the rest of the flight. I'll check on you again soon." As she turned away, Martin's gaze followed her. His mind was churning, not just with anger, but with the implications of the incident. This wasn't just about him. This was about accountability, and he intended to see it through. A storm brews. In the cockpit, word of the incident had reached Captain James Monroe. The veteran pilot, known for his calm demeanor under pressure, listened intently as Rachel relayed the situation. "She slapped a passenger," he repeated, his voice low but firm. "Are you certain?" Rachel nodded, her expression strained. "Everyone saw it, Captain." It's all anyone is talking about back there. Captain Monroe's brow furrowed. Contact the airline immediately. They need to prepare for this when we land. Rachel hesitated. What should we do about Clara? She'll stay out of sight for the rest of the flight. Monroe interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. And make sure the passenger is looked after. This needs to be handled carefully, or it'll be a PR nightmare. Rachel nodded and left the cockpit, her stomach churning. She knew Monroe was right, but the reality of the situation was daunting. Clara had been a mentor to her when she first joined the airline, a role model of poise and professionalism. Seeing her falter so spectacularly felt surreal. Clara faces the crew. As Rachel re-entered the galley, she found Clara sitting on a small fold-down seat, her head in her hands. The older woman looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "What's going to happen?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel hesitated. "The captain's informed the airline. They'll have a team waiting when we land." Clara's face crumpled, and for a moment, Rachel thought she might break down entirely. "I've ruined everything," Clara said, her voice cracking. "My career, my reputation. I don't know what came over me." Rachel softened, kneeling beside her. "Clara, I've seen you handle situations 100 times tougher than this. What happened back there?" Clara hesitated, her gaze distant. "I've been struggling," she admitted. "The stress, the constant pressure to be perfect, always smiling, always accommodating. Lately, it's felt like I'm on a tightrope, and today, I snapped." Rachel placed a hand on Clara's arm, unsure of what to say. She felt a pang of sympathy, but she also knew that sympathy wouldn't fix what had happened. Passengers take sides. Meanwhile, the cabin was abuzz with speculation and judgment. Passengers debated the incident in hushed tones, their emotions running high. "She should be fired," one man said firmly. "There's no excuse for laying hands on a customer." Another passenger, a young woman, frowned. "We don't know what that guy said to her. Maybe he pushed her too far." "It doesn't matter what he said," the man countered. "She's a professional. She's supposed to handle these situations with grace." In row 12, an elderly woman turned to her husband. "I feel bad for her," she whispered. You could see it on her face. She wasn't in the right state of mind. Her husband shook his head. "Feel bad or not, she's got to face the consequences. That slap wasn't just a mistake, it was a choice." The debates only deepened the divisions among the passengers. Some sympathized with Clara, recognizing the immense pressures of her job. Others sided with Martin, viewing the incident as an unforgivable breach of trust. Preparing for landing. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers exchanged glances, anticipating the confrontation that would undoubtedly occur once they landed. Martin, still seated in the back, watched as Rachel approached him one final time. "Mr. Hayes, we're preparing for landing," she said softly. "I just want to make sure you're okay." Martin gave a curt nod. "I'll be fine once I've spoken to your supervisor." Rachel nodded and retreated, her heart sinking. She could feel the weight of the incident pressing down on the entire crew. Clara remained in the galley, avoiding the passengers' stares. She had straightened her uniform and composed herself, but the haunted look in her eyes betrayed her turmoil. As the wheels touched down on the tarmac, the captain's voice came over the intercom, thanking passengers for their patience and cooperation. The words felt hollow, given the tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. At the gate, the airline supervisor and a security officer were already waiting. Clara braced herself, knowing that her actions would soon be laid bare for judgment. But what she didn't know was that the story was far from over, and that the fallout would extend far beyond the confines of Flight 567. Confrontation at the gate. The plane rolled to a stop at Gate C-15, the engine's hum fading as passengers unbuckled their seatbelts and gathered their belongings. Despite the usual scramble to retrieve overhead luggage, the air remained heavy with unease. Whispers continued to ripple through the cabin as people prepared to disembark, their eyes darting toward the galley where Clara stood, her head bowed. At the gate, Olivia Carter, the airline's on-ground supervisor, waited with a composed but stern expression. Beside her stood a security officer, his presence underscoring the seriousness of the situation. Olivia had been briefed mid-flight about the incident and knew this wasn't going to be an easy resolution. She reviewed the notes she'd received and adjusted her blazer, preparing for what was sure to be an explosive confrontation. Passengers depart. As the cabin door opened, passengers began filing out. Most avoided looking directly at Clara, though a few cast lingering glances filled with judgment or pity. A couple of passengers muttered their thoughts as they passed Rachel, who stood at the front of the plane. "She's done for," a young man whispered to his companion, shaking his head. "You can't come back from something like that." "I don't know," his friend replied. "Maybe she just had a bad day. We all snap sometimes." Rachel forced a tight smile, her mind racing. She knew the passengers weren't wrong. Clara's career was hanging by a thread, and the outcome of the next few minutes would determine whether it survived at all. When Martin finally stood to leave, the cabin seemed to hold its collective breath. His movements were deliberate, his shoulders squared, and his face set in grim determination. He didn't look at Clara as he exited, but his silence was more damning than any words he could have spoken. The meeting begins. The moment Clara stepped off the plane, Olivia intercepted her, her tone professional but firm. "Clara Jensen." Clara nodded, her face pale. "Yes, please follow me," Olivia said, her words clipped. "We need to discuss what happened." Martin was already seated in a small conference room near the gate, the security officer standing nearby. Olivia gestured for Clara to enter, closing the door behind them. Rachel lingered just outside, unsure if she should intervene or stay out of the way. Inside, the tension was palpable. Martin sat with his arms crossed, his cheek still faintly red from the slap. Clara avoided his gaze, staring instead at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. "Let's begin," Olivia said, her tone authoritative. She turned to Clara first. "You are aware of why we're here?" Clara nodded, her voice barely audible. "Yes." "Good. I want to hear your account of what happened." Clara took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she spoke. "It started as a disagreement over a seat change. Mr. Hayes asked to move to an empty seat, but I couldn't authorize it. He became upset, and I lost my composure. She paused, her voice catching. "I slapped him. I don't have an excuse for what I did. It was wrong." Olivia nodded, her expression unreadable. She turned to Martin. "Mr. Hayes, would you like to share your perspective?" Martin's jaw tightened as he began. "I asked for a simple accommodation." Her response was dismissive and rude from the start. I tried to explain my situation, but she escalated the tension with her tone. When I expressed my frustration, she lashed out. That slap wasn't just physical. It was humiliating. I was treated like a problem rather than a paying customer. His word hung in the air, each one a sharp dagger of truth. Clara flinched but remained silent, knowing there was little she could say to defend herself. Olivia exhaled, her gaze shifting between the two. "Thank you both for your honesty. Clara, I need you to understand that the airline has a zero-tolerance policy for physical altercations. Regardless of the circumstances, your actions were unacceptable." Clara's shoulders slumped, tears pooling in her eyes. "I know. I let my emotions get the better of me." "The turning point," Olivia continued, her tone softening slightly. "However, I also recognize that our crew members operate under immense pressure. This incident is not just about what happened in the moment, but about the larger context. Clara, is there something going on outside of work that might have contributed to your reaction?" Clara hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. "It's been a rough few months," she admitted. "My mother passed away recently, and I've been struggling to keep it together. Work has been my escape, but it's also been overwhelming. I'm not excusing what I did, Just explaining. Olivia's expression softened further. She knew that personal struggles often compounded the stress of a high-pressure job, but she also had a responsibility to maintain the airline's standards. She turned to Martin. "Mr. Hayes, I understand this was a deeply upsetting experience. What can we do to make this right?" Martin leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "I want a formal apology from the airline," he said firmly, "and I expect measures to be put in place to ensure this never happens again." "That's fair," Olivia replied. She made a note before looking back at Clara. "As for you, Clara, I'm afraid there's no way to overlook this. Effective immediately, you're suspended without pay pending a full investigation." Clara nodded, her face pale but composed. "I understand." The aftermath. As Clara exited the conference room, her emotions threatened to overwhelm her. She walked briskly past Rachel, who caught up with her a few steps later. "Clara," Rachel called softly, placing a hand on her arm. "Are you okay?" "No," Clara admitted, tears spilling over, "but I have to face the consequences." Rachel hesitated before pulling Clara into a hug. "You're not alone," she said quietly. "We all snap sometimes. I wish this hadn't happened." Clara nodded, wiping her tears as she stepped back. "Thank you, Rachel. That means a lot." A divided public. By the time Clara reached her car in the employee parking lot, the incident had already begun to spread on social media. Passengers had shared snippets of their accounts online, sparking the heated debate. "Unprofessional and unacceptable," one user tweeted, accompanied by a photo of Clara looking distressed as she exited the gate area. "This flight attendant deserves to be fired." Others were more sympathetic. "Imagine the stress she must have been under to react like that." Another wrote, "We need to stop dehumanizing service workers." As the story gained traction, the airline's official statement came under scrutiny. While some praised their swift response, others questioned whether Clara's suspension was enough, or too much. The incident had become a flashpoint for broader conversations about workplace stress, customer behavior, and the unrealistic expectations placed on service industry employees. Clara's reflection. At home, Clara sat alone in her small apartment, replaying the incident in her mind. The slap, Martin's stunned expression, the whispers of the passengers. It all felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Her phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, some offering support and others expressing disbelief. She opened a text from Rachel. "If you need someone to talk to, I'm here. Don't give up." Clara stared at the message for a long moment before typing a reply. "Thank you. I don't know what's next, but I appreciate it." As she set her phone aside, Clara resolved to face whatever came next, knowing that her actions would have consequences, but also hoping for a chance at redemption. The story was far from over, and the impact of what happened on Flight 567 would ripple far beyond the confines of the plane. The story goes public. By the next morning, the incident on Flight 567 had become national news. Clara's name hadn't been officially released, but the story of the flight attendant who slapped a passenger was everywhere. Social media exploded with debates, think pieces, and amateur analysis. A blurry cell phone video from one of the passengers had been uploaded to several platforms, showing the exact moment Clara's hand connected with Martin's cheek. The slap, accompanied by the collective gasp of the cabin, had already been viewed millions of times. The online frenzy. The internet was ablaze with reactions. Hashtags like #Flight567 and #Slapgate trended across platforms. Memes began circulating, some mocking Clara's actions, others sympathizing with her. One image, captioned "Customer Service in 2024, showed a flight attendant mid-slap, while another caption read, "She did what we all wish we could." The discourse was divided. Many sided with Martin, framing the incident as emblematic of poor service and a lack of professionalism. Others, however, pointed to the high-stress conditions flight attendants faced daily, arguing that Clara's reaction was a symptom of a larger problem. "I can't believe she slapped a paying customer," one Twitter user wrote. "This is why service jobs need more oversight." Another user replied, "Maybe the customer was being abusive. We don't know the full story. Flight attendants aren't robots." Soon, passengers from Flight 567 began sharing their perspectives online. Some recounted how the situation escalated, while others criticized both Clara and Martin for their roles in the incident. One post, allegedly from a passenger seated near Martin, claimed that he had been rude from the start. "He kept raising his voice," the post read. "Sure, the slap was uncalled for, but he wasn't innocent in this." The narrative was no longer clear-cut. What had seemed like an open and shut case of unprofessionalism now had shades of complexity. Clara faces the fallout. Clara sat at her kitchen table, staring at her laptop. Every news site seemed to feature the story, and her heart sank further with each headline. She had avoided looking at social media, but curiosity and dread got the better of her. The comments were brutal. "She deserves to be fired," one user wrote. "No excuse for putting your hands on someone." Another comment struck a nerve. "This is what happens when companies overwork their employees. Clara isn't the problem. The system is." Clara closed the laptop with trembling hands. She felt like a prisoner in her own home. The weight of public scrutiny was unbearable, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd ruined not only her career but also her life. The suspension, while temporary, felt permanent in her mind. Who would want to hire her after this? Her phone buzzed. It was Rachel. "Hey, Clara," Rachel said gently. "How are you holding up?" "Not great," Clara admitted. "I feel like I've lost everything." Rachel hesitated before responding. "You haven't lost everything. People are talking about this, but it's not all bad. Some are defending you." Clara let out a humorless laugh. "Defending me? Did you see the video? I look like a monster." "You're not a monster," Rachel said firmly. "You made a mistake, a big one, but that doesn't define who you are." The words brought little comfort. Clara thanked Rachel and hung up, her thoughts spiraling once more. Could she ever recover from this? The airline responds. Meanwhile, the airline found itself at the center of a growing controversy. The company had initially hoped its swift response, suspending Clara and issuing a formal apology to Martin, would quash the uproar. Instead, it only fueled the fire. Critics accused the airline of throwing Clara under the bus without fully investigating the incident. Former employees began speaking out about the company's toxic work culture, sharing stories of burnout, harassment, and a lack of mental health resources. "This is what happens when you prioritize profits over people," one former flight attendant tweeted. The airline failed Clara as much as she failed her passenger. The airline's CEO, James Caldwell, issued a second statement. "We understand the public's concerns and are committed to reviewing our policies and practices. Our goal is to ensure the safety and well-being of both our passengers and employees." The statement did little to appease the public. If anything, it added fuel to the growing debate about workplace conditions in the airline industry. Advocacy groups seized the opportunity to push for reform, demanding better support systems for flight attendants and other service workers. Martin speaks out. Amid the uproar, Martin decided to break his silence. He sat down for an interview with a prominent news network, hoping to share his side of the story. "I want to be clear," Martin began, his voice calm but firm. "I didn't ask for this to become a media circus. My issue isn't with the flight attendant as a person. It's with what happened. I felt disrespected and humiliated in front of dozens of people. That's not something you can just brush off." The interviewer nodded. "What would you like to see happen moving forward?" "I want accountability," Martin replied. "But more importantly, I want airlines to take a hard look at how they train their staff. Clearly, there's a deeper issue here, and it needs to be addressed." Martin's measured tone earned him sympathy from some viewers, but others saw his words as overly harsh. "This guy's milking it for attention," one comment read. "Let it go already. The tides begin to turn." As the days passed, the narrative around the incident began to shift. A former flight attendant who had worked with Clara came forward, describing her as a dedicated employee who had always gone above and beyond for passengers. "She's one of the best," the former colleague said in an interview. "Whatever happened on that flight, it's not who she is. Clara's been under immense stress lately, and I think that played a role." Mental health experts weighed in, pointing out the high-pressure environments flight attendants worked in. "This isn't about excusing bad behavior," one expert said during a panel discussion. "It's about understanding the factors that lead to these situations and addressing them proactively." The public conversation began to broaden, focusing less on Clara's individual actions and more on the systemic issues within the airline industry. Stories of overworked flight attendants and inadequate support flooded social media, painting a grim picture of life behind the smiles. A glimmer of hope. For Clara, the days following the incident were a blur of self-doubt and anxiety. She avoided the news, trying to focus on anything but the chaos she had unleashed. One evening, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from a passenger on Flight 567. Clara hesitated before opening it, her hands trembling. The letter was handwritten, the script neat and deliberate. "Dear Clara, I was on the flight that day. I saw what happened, and I saw the look on your face afterward. I can't imagine what you've been going through, but I want you to know that not everyone is against you. People make mistakes, and I believe you deserve a chance to make things right. Sincerely, a passenger who understands." Clara read the letter twice, tears streaming down her face. It was a small gesture, but it reminded her that not all hope was lost. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a path to redemption. The question now was whether she could find the strength to walk it. Seeking redemption. The next few weeks were among the longest of Clara's life. Every day brought new headlines, social media threads, and debates. Her name, once a point of pride among her colleagues and family, now seemed like a burden. The suspension loomed over her like a storm cloud, and the uncertainty of her future was suffocating. Clara felt trapped, not only by the consequences of her actions, but by the public scrutiny that refused to let the incident fade away. The aftermath within the airline. At the airline's headquarters, the leadership team grappled with the growing fallout. The airline was under fire not only for Clara's actions, but for its handling of the situation. Employees, current and former, were vocal about the unrealistic expectations placed on flight attendants. "We're not just serving drinks and pointing to emergency exits," one anonymous employee shared in an op-ed. "We're de-escalating conflicts, managing emergencies, and bearing the brunt of passenger frustrations. And we're doing it all while being overworked and underappreciated." The company's CEO, James Caldwell, convened a crisis management meeting to address the mounting criticism. "We need to show that we're serious about change," Caldwell said, his voice firm but tense. "If this continues to spiral, it won't just be about Clara. It'll be about our entire industry." The team brainstormed ways to improve their image. Increased mental health support, de-escalation training, and more reasonable schedules for flight attendants were all discussed. But the deeper question lingered. Could these changes come soon enough to prevent further damage? Clara takes responsibility. For Clara, the isolation was unbearable. Her phone rarely rang, and when it did, it was often Rachel or her sister, Emma, trying to lift her spirits. Clara knew she couldn't stay silent forever. She needed to confront what had happened, not just for her own peace of mind, but for the many voices debating her actions without knowing the full story. One evening, Clara sat at her small kitchen table and drafted a statement. She poured her heart into the words, hoping to convey both remorse and accountability. After hours of revising, she finally settled on the message. Clara's statement: "I want to take this opportunity to sincerely apologize for my actions on Flight 567. There is no excuse for what I did, and I take full responsibility for my behavior. I let my emotions overwhelm me in a moment of weakness, and I failed to live up to the standards I hold myself to as a flight attendant." The truth is, I have been struggling with personal challenges and the pressures of my job, but that does not justify my actions. To Mr. Hayes, the passengers on the flight, and my colleagues, I am deeply sorry for the distress I caused. This incident has been a wake-up call for me, and I am committed to making amends and growing from this experience. I hope that this can be a starting point for a broader conversation about the challenges faced by service industry workers and the importance of mental health support in high-pressure roles. Thank you for allowing me the chance to address this. Clara posted her statement on a newly created social media account. Within hours, it began circulating widely. Reactions were mixed, but the tone of the conversation shifted slightly. Some praised her for taking accountability, while others dismissed her apology as too little, too late. Martin's surprising move. Meanwhile, Martin Hayes had been following the developments with a mix of frustration and curiosity. He had expected the airline to issue a swift resolution, but instead, the incident had become a cultural flashpoint. The backlash against Clara, especially the personal attacks on her character, had begun to weigh on him. While Martin still felt deeply hurt by what had happened, he couldn't ignore the human side of the story. He reached out to the airline, requesting a private meeting with Clara. The request surprised everyone involved, including Clara, who was hesitant but agreed. The meeting took place in a neutral space, a private conference room in a downtown office. Clara arrived early, her hands clammy as she fidgeted with her notes. She had prepared an apology, though she wasn't sure Martin would accept it. When Martin walked in, his presence filled the room. He was calm, but there was an air of expectation around him. He sat across from Clara, their eyes meeting briefly before she looked away. "Thank you for meeting with me," Clara began, her voice shaky but sincere. "I wanted to say, face to face, how deeply sorry I am for what I did. It was completely unacceptable, and I regret my actions every single day." Martin studied her for a moment before responding. "I appreciate your apology," he said. "But I need to understand, why did it happen? What pushed you to that point?" Clara hesitated, then spoke candidly. "I've been carrying a lot, personal grief, work stress, and a sense of not being enough. None of that excuses what I did, but it made me snap. I wish I could take it back." Martin nodded slowly, his expression softening. "We all have breaking points," he said. "But what you did humiliated me. It's not something I'll forget easily." "I understand," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to acknowledge the harm I caused and let you know I'm working to be better." For a moment, there was silence. Then Martin sighed. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, but I respect that you're taking responsibility. I hope you find a way to move forward, and that the airline learns something from this too." The public reacts. News of the meeting leaked shortly after, and it sparked yet another wave of discourse. Many saw it as a positive step toward resolution, while others criticized both Clara and Martin for their roles in perpetuating the incident. She apologized, and he listened. "That's more than most people would do," one commenter wrote. Another countered, "This doesn't change the fact that she crossed a line. Actions have consequences." Clara's path forward. The airline's investigation concluded weeks later. Clara's suspension was upheld, but she was not terminated. Instead, she was offered the chance to return after completing a mandatory retraining program, which included conflict resolution, stress management, and counseling. It was a second chance, one that Clara didn't take lightly. As Clara worked through the program, she began to feel a sense of clarity and purpose. She started volunteering at a local mental health organization, sharing her story to raise awareness about the challenges faced by service workers. Slowly, she rebuilt her confidence and sense of self. The industry takes notice. The fallout from Flight 567 led to industry-wide discussions about workplace conditions for flight attendants. Airlines announced new initiatives, including improved mental health resources and enhanced training for handling difficult passengers. Clara's story became a catalyst for change. though the path to reform was far from straightforward. For Clara, the journey was still ongoing. She had made a mistake, one that could never be erased, but she was determined to turn it into something meaningful. As she prepared to return to work, she carried with her a renewed sense of purpose and a commitment to doing better. Her story, though painful, was not over. It was a reminder that even in the face of public scrutiny and personal failure, redemption was possible, if one was willing to face the truth and grow from it. Redemption and legacy. 6 months had passed since the incident on Flight 567, a period that Clara would later describe as the most transformative of her life. The journey back to stability and self-respect had been anything but smooth, but it had taught her lessons she could never have learned otherwise. As she prepared for her first flight back, she felt a mix of apprehension and cautious optimism. A return to the skies. Clara arrived at the airport early, her new uniform crisp and her badge gleaming. The retraining program had not only taught her technical skills, but also helped her confront the emotional toll her job had taken on her. Therapy sessions had forced her to unpack the grief she had buried after her mother's passing and the burnout she had ignored for years. Now she felt more equipped to handle the challenges ahead. Rachel, who had been her steadfast supporter, greeted her at the crew lounge with a wide smile. "Welcome back," she said, pulling Clara into a hug. "How are you feeling?" "Nervous," Clara admitted, "but ready." The flight crew for the day had been carefully chosen to include supportive colleagues. Even so, Clara noticed a few skeptical glances from those who knew her story. She couldn't blame them. Her reputation had been tarnished. Earning their trust back would take time. The first flight. As passengers boarded, Clara focused on maintaining her composure. Each interaction was an opportunity to prove that she was still the competent, compassionate professional she had once been. She greeted every passenger with genuine warmth, even as a few cast curious or wary looks. One woman, an older passenger seated near the front, paused as Clara helped her stow her bag. "You're the one from the news, aren't you?" she asked quietly. Clara froze for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am. That was me." The woman studied her for a long moment before smiling. "Well, we all make mistakes. What matters is how you move forward." The comment felt like a small but significant victory. Clara smiled back. "Thank you. I'm doing my best." As the flight progressed, Clara found herself slipping back into her old rhythm. When a young mother struggled to calm her crying baby, Clara knelt beside her seat, offering kind words and a small toy from the airline's stash. When a nervous flyer expressed his anxiety, she spent a few extra minutes explaining the safety procedures and reassuring him. These small acts of kindness reminded Clara why she had loved her job in the first place. Martin's quiet gesture. Unbeknownst to Clara, Martin Hayes had been following her journey from a distance. After their meeting, he had decided to drop his complaint against her, feeling that she had faced enough consequences. He hadn't spoken publicly about his decision, wanting to avoid further media attention. One day, while watching a news segment on the airline's new mental health initiatives, he saw Clara's face flash across the screen. She was speaking at a panel discussion about the challenges faced by service workers, her voice steady and impassioned. Martin felt a twinge of respect for her resilience. Inspired, Martin reached out to the airline with an idea. He proposed a program to bridge the gap between passengers and crew, fostering mutual understanding and respect. To his surprise, the airline agreed, and within weeks, the initiative, dubbed Flying Together, was launched. It included workshops, videos, and in-flight announcements, encouraging kindness and patience on both sides. Clara's role in change. Clara became a key advocate for the program, using her experience to highlight the importance of empathy. She began speaking at industry conferences and writing articles about the need for systemic change. Her story, once a source of shame, became a catalyst for broader discussions about workplace stress, mental health, and the unrealistic expectations placed on service workers. Despite her newfound advocacy work, Clara remained committed to her role as a flight attendant. She found that her interactions with passengers now carried deeper meaning. Each kind word, each small act of service, felt like a step toward redemption. The airline's transformation. The airline itself underwent significant changes. Employee support programs were expanded, including access to counseling and mental health resources. Flight schedules were adjusted to allow for more rest between shifts, and de-escalation training became a cornerstone of crew preparation. These reforms didn't happen overnight, and not all employees were convinced they would stick. But the dialogue sparked by Clara's story had made one thing clear. Ignoring the well-being of workers was no longer an option. Passengers, too, began to notice a shift. The Flying Together program was well received, with many commenting on the improved atmosphere aboard flights. One frequent traveler remarked, "It's like everyone, crew and passengers, finally understands we're all in this together." A meeting of paths. Months after her return, Clara was preparing to board a flight when she saw a familiar face in the terminal. Martin Hayes stood by the gate, suitcase in hand. Their eyes met, and for a moment, both hesitated. Then Martin approached her. "Clara," he said, his tone neutral but warm. "It's good to see you." Clara smiled cautiously. "It's good to see you too, Mr. Hayes." "Martin," he corrected. "How have you been?" "Better," she admitted. "It's been a journey, but I'm finding my way." "I can see that," Martin said, nodding. "You've turned something difficult into something meaningful. That's not easy to do." Clara felt a lump in her throat. "Thank you," she said softly. "And thank you for your part in making things better, for everyone." Martin smiled faintly. "We're all learning. That's what matters." They parted with a handshake, a silent acknowledgement of how far they had both come. For Clara, the encounter felt like the closing of a chapter, not an erasure of the past, but a reconciliation with it, a legacy of growth. As time went on, Clara's story became less about the slap and more about what it had led to, a deeper understanding of the pressures faced by service workers, meaningful reforms within the airline industry, and a renewed focus on empathy in high-pressure environments. For Clara, the incident would always be a painful memory, but it no longer defined her. It was a lesson, a turning point, and a reminder that even in the face of failure, redemption was possible. Years later, as she trained a new class of flight attendants, Clara shared her story, not as a cautionary tale, but as an example of resilience. "We're all human," she told them. "We'll make mistakes. What matters is how we grow from them." The room was silent as her words sank in. Then one trainee raised their hand. "And what if we feel like we can't recover?" Clara smiled gently. "You can. I'm living proof." As she continued her career, Clara found fulfillment not just in her work, but in knowing that her darkest moment had led to a brighter future, not just for herself, but for an entire industry. Clara's story wasn't just about surviving a personal crisis. It became a tale of transformation, one that rippled far beyond her own life. As the airline industry grappled with the issues her incident had exposed, Clara herself found new ways to rebuild her career and sense of purpose. A flight to redemption. Months after Clara's return, she found herself on a long-haul flight from New York to London. It was a full flight, and the cabin buzzed with the usual mix of excitement and fatigue. Clara moved through the aisles with practiced ease, helping passengers stow bags, calming nervous flyers, and ensuring everything was in place for takeoff. Midway through the flight, a passenger in the economy section called for assistance. Clara approached and found an older man struggling with an oxygen tank that had malfunctioned. He looked panicked, his breath coming in short gasps. "Let me help you," Clara said gently, her voice calm and steady. She quickly assessed the situation, signaled to a colleague for backup, and began troubleshooting the device. Within moments, she had resolved the issue, and the man's breathing evened out. "Thank you," he said, his voice shaky but grateful. "You saved me." "It's my job," Clara replied with a reassuring smile. But as she returned to the galley, she realized that it felt like more than just her job. It was her chance to make a difference, one passenger at a time. The ripple effect. Clara's return to work coincided with broader changes in the airline industry. The reforms sparked by her story began to take root. Flight attendants were given additional resources, such as mental health hotlines and wellness programs. Training now included real-world scenarios to better prepare crew members for high-pressure situations. The Flying Together program also became a success, fostering a culture of mutual respect between passengers and crew. In-flight announcements emphasized kindness, and passengers were offered small gestures of appreciation, like thank you cards to give to crew members who went above and beyond. One day, Clara received one of those cards. It was from a young woman who had observed her comforting a child traveling alone. "Thank you for making this flight easier for him, and for showing what kindness looks like," the note read. Clara tucked the card into her pocket, her heart swelling with pride. These moments reminded her why she had chosen this career in the first place. Clara's growing influence. As Clara rebuilt her reputation within the airline, she also became a sought-after speaker at industry events. Her willingness to share her story with honesty and humility resonated with audiences. She didn't shy away from the details of the slap or the fallout. It was a part of her journey, and she owned it. At one conference, she addressed a room of aviation professionals. "I didn't handle that moment well," she said, her voice steady. "But what I've learned is that none of us operate in isolation. The pressures we face, whether as crew members or passengers, don't disappear when we board a plane. That's why empathy is so important. It's what turns conflict into connection." Her speech received a standing ovation, and afterward, several attendees approached her to share their own stories of struggle and resilience. Clara realized that by being vulnerable, she was helping others feel less alone. Martin and Clara. A final meeting. A year after the incident, Clara received an unexpected invitation. Martin Hayes had asked her to join him at a panel discussion on workplace stress and customer interactions. The event was organized by a nonprofit advocating for employee rights in service industries. Clara hesitated at first. While she and Martin had reached an understanding, their shared history was fraught. But ultimately, she agreed, knowing that the discussion could amplify an important message. When they met backstage, Martin greeted her with a smile. "Clara, it's good to see you," he said warmly. "And you," she replied, her tone genuine. On stage, the two shared their perspectives. Martin spoke about the humiliation he'd felt that day and how it had changed his views on the importance of respectful communication. Clara discussed her struggles with grief and burnout, and how they had clouded her judgment. By the end of the panel, it was clear that their story wasn't just about a conflict. It was about growth, reconciliation, and the power of dialogue. The audience gave them a standing ovation, and as Clara and Martin exited the stage, they shared a quiet moment of understanding. "Thank you," Martin said, "for being willing to face this head-on." "Thank you," Clara replied, "for giving me a chance to." A new chapter. As Clara continued her career, she found herself thriving in ways she hadn't anticipated. She became a mentor to younger flight attendants, sharing her insights and encouraging them to prioritize their well-being. She also worked with the airline to develop new training modules, ensuring that her lessons would benefit others. At home, Clara felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. The isolation and shame that had once consumed her were gone, replaced by a deep gratitude for the second chance she'd been given. One evening, as she flipped through a journal she had started during her suspension, she came across a line she had written on one of her darkest days. "This isn't the end. It's a beginning." She smiled, realizing how true those words had become. Legacy of change. Clara's story became more than just a momentary scandal. It sparked lasting change, not only within her airline but across the industry. Flight attendants, inspired by her advocacy, began pushing for better conditions and greater respect. Passengers, too, became more aware of the human beings behind the uniforms. Years later, Clara retired from flying but remained an active voice in the industry. Her story was taught in training programs as an example of the complexities of human interaction and the importance of accountability and compassion. Clara's journey proved that even the most painful mistakes could lead to profound growth. She had turned a moment of failure into a lifetime of impact, leaving behind a legacy of resilience, empathy, and hope.